So today in class, you're going to be beginning to prep your paper for our linoleum print project. So the paper is the background in which we're going to print our image on. Today, we're going to work on some different techniques, and you will also get to start painting your background paper for your project. You may not get finished, and that's absolutely fine. We will finish those up in class tomorrow. On your table, you're going to see a couple of things. One is your watercolor technique sheet. There's a colored printed version on the table if you would like to see the detail of these better. And on your table, you also have your watercolor techniques sheet of yours that you picked up on the way in. First thing that you need to do is on the top of that paper, take your pencil, your pen, and right now go ahead and write your name at the top and your class period in case we hang on to these and you need to get yours back. So looking at the example and what our first few steps are, we're going to do some techniques, so a blending, a wash, adding something and manipulating it with some paper towel and some plastic as well. You are going to be using the watercolor sets, a water container, and a watercolor brush. So a watercolor brush is going to be a brush that has really soft bristles, and it also holds a lot of paint so that we can apply it to our paper. We've got all of our colors that are in here, and we use them until all of the color is gone. Even though there's what looks like a small amount in here, watercolor paint is concentrated. This is a pigment plus gum arabic. That's why it's kind of sticky, and that holds the color together. To activate this, we have to add water. It never at any point should it work like acrylic or like tempera paint. It shouldn't be thick as you apply it to your paper. It should be really thin washes of color. So I'm going to go to my water container. I'm going to choose the color that I'm going to start with. I'm going to drop some water into it. Now, if these have been used in previous classes, they may have already be activated. You may not have to add as much water, but if it's set overnight, sometimes you do. So I've added some water to it. Then I'm going to start to mix so that I create my paint. So I'm going to take my brush and swirl it around. The more that I swirl it, the more pigment is mixed together with the water, and I create a darker value of paint. You can always kind of check the color that you've got at the top of the lid to see if you've made enough for yourself. If not, then you can continue mixing. You can always blend and mix colors in the lid if you would like to, if you're creating a brand new color. The first thing that I'm going to do on my paper is I'm going to prep it and get it ready. So if you want watercolor to fill a really big area, you're going to add a wash of water first. It's going to allow the paper to absorb some of that water so that when you add the watercolor, you can spread it out nice and evenly. So just a wash of water first. And then I'm going to start applying my color. So I'm going to do something similar to this one where I'm adding a color at the top. Instantly as I put it onto the paper starts to soak it in. One thing that will be different from this to your project paper is this is copy paper. This is for practice. It's just kind of like a sketch if we were working on an artwork. I'm going to do this first. I'm going to go to my next color and activate that. And then this is supposed to be kind of like a tie-dye effect. So when I apply this here, you can see that it starts to move, it starts to soak in. You can always help it along by taking your brush and moving it or adding more water to blend. This is really good practice to show you how much color you actually need versus what we would use for like tempera, because they're very different. All right, next one is a gradient. So we're creating a dark to light. This is monochromatic, meaning it goes from one color and it gets lighter as it goes down. Again, filling in a big area, so I'm going to do a wash of watercolor. I'm not going to start this right at the line because watercolor spreads. So I'm going to move down a little bit and leave some space. I'm going to choose a color that's going to show up really well. And I'm going to apply that as it moves down. It gets a little bit lighter because I start to run out of color. If it's ever too dark, you can always wash out your brush, dry it with your paper towel, and pick some of it up You can also blend colors, so I can come in here and get a darker color and add it to this as well, and transition one color to the next. Again, as I move down, I'm running out of paint, and it gets a little bit lighter. The next one that I'm going to do is where my salt technique. So I'm looking at applying color that I want to spread out. The salt technique, the paint really needs to be sitting on the surface. So it takes a good amount. It should be kind of like a puddle on the surface. If all of the water and the paint soaks in, the salt will have nothing to react with on the surface. So you have to make sure that it's puddled. I can see it sitting on the surface. And I take a little plastic cup. There's one of these for every table, and while that paint is still wet and sitting on the surface, I'm going to drop it in. It's going to give you a grainy bubble-like texture. And you don't need a lot of it because we let this sit, we let it dry, and then once it's dry, we rake it off into the trash can, and it'll have this little bubble-like effect. If you apply it and the paint has already soaked in, you're not going to see any effect. There's going to be nothing that really shows up or happens with it. Last one is creating texture. So you may be working on a painting in the future and it needs to have kind of a rugged texture or something with some line work in it. Again, you want a color that's going to sit on the surface like a puddle. We can use a paper towel, crumple it up so that there's some wrinkles, and then you can dab that onto it. It blends a color. You could blend two colors this way. You could also use some texture. All right, so those are our 4 techniques that we're looking at, just experimenting and trying. When we're finished with this, I'm just gonna set it to the side. We'll decide at the end of the class whether we're gonna keep it or not, and we'll move on to our project paper. Underneath of the windowsill, where we pick up a lot of our materials, there are stacks of watercolor paper. So you're going to notice this is thicker than a normal drawing paper, and you're going to need 4 pieces. On the back of these pieces, you're going to flip it over. You're going to write your name and your class period. And this happens a lot because some people will paint it blue and use a salt technique, and then someone else sees it and they think it's theirs. And you have to make sure that your name is on it so that you can double check that you have your pieces and these are your artworks. So we're going to work on these one at a time. You've got your name on the back, and we're going to paint it with a technique. So you're going to decide, do I want it to be monochromatic? Do I want this to have an analogous color scheme? We've talked about these different color schemes before break. We talked about it and reviewed it when we came back. Monochromatic works really well with this. Analogous colors, because they're next to each other on the color wheel, they blend. So yellows, reds, and oranges blend really well because they're next to each other on the color wheel. Colors that don't work really well are sometimes complementaries. Complements look really nice next to each other, but when you mix them, because they're opposites on the color wheel, they create a really dark color. So if we took warrior colors like orange and blue and we mix them together, they start to create this dark value. And some people don't want that. So think about your color scheme of what you're going to do. These could be all the same. They could be all different. It's up to you. I am going to paint this so that I go all the way to the edges. Unless it's a part of your design, you really want to see that color go all the way to the edge. Makes it look nice and complete. This is somewhere where I want my color to spread out a lot. So I need to prep my paper by adding water first. I'm going to go in and choose my first color. You usually want to start with your lighter values first. And you'll notice that your paper will start to bend up a little bit. It'll kind of change shape because you've added water to it. It'll dry flat. When you add and drop in that color, I want to do a tie-dye effect. So I'm going to kind of dot some color in. And I'm going to blend some colors. So I've got some red I'm going to switch over to my orange. Did wash out my brush before adding this. And I'm going to work my way across. Again, because I prepped my paper and I added that water first, as soon as I start applying this, it stands out really well. And it starts to move. So of course, watercolor, you've got to have that different watercolor values that you're going to work with. And I'm going to work myself all the way across my paper. Making sure I get all the way to the edges. I can always come back once it dries a little bit too and add a second layer if I wanted to. But if you want anything to blend, the paper has to be wet and prepped. All right, so I'm going for something similar to this one that I painted last time. And all of your papers could be the same colors, could have the same color schemes, or they could be different. I'm going to let that be up to you. When I'm finished with these, we are going to put them on the drying rack, but you're going to notice because of the shape that they don't fit. They're going to fall through those metal bars. So next to the drying rack is that yellow, kind of old paper, and we're going to use that. So you've got to have something to put your project onto before you set it on the drying rack. So they're big sheets of paper. You'll be able to set all 4 of these on there and then put them on one of the racks.